You're listening to the CyberWire Network, powered by N2K.
Do you know the status of your compliance controls right now? Like, right now. We know that real-time visibility is critical for security, but when it comes to our GRC programs, we rely on point-in-time checks. But get this. More than 8,000 companies like Atlassian and Quora have continuous visibility into their controls with Vanta. Here's the gist. Vanta brings automation to evidence collection across 30 frameworks, like SOC 2 and ISO 27001. They also centralize key workflows like policies, access reviews, and reporting, and helps you get security questionnaires done 5 times faster with AI. Now that's a new way to GRC. Get $1,000 off Vanta when you go to vanta.com/cyber. That's vanta.com/cyber for $1,000 off. CISA urges senior government officials to enhance mobile device security. Russian state-sponsored hacker group Sandworm is targeting Ukrainian soldiers. A website bug and GPS tracking firm Happen is exposing customer information. Multiple critical vulnerabilities have been identified in Sharp-branded routers. Ireland's Data Protection Commission fines Meta $263 million for alleged GDPR violations. Google releases an urgent Chrome security update to address 4 high-rated vulnerabilities. Cyber attacks on India-based organizations surged 92% year-over-year. Cyber criminals target Google Calendar to launch phishing attacks. Fortinet patches a critical vulnerability in FortiWLM. Juniper Networks warns of a botnet infection targeting routers with default credentials. Our guest is Jeff Kroll, principal and practice leader of Baker Tilly's cybersecurity practice, with advice on using employee access controls to limit internal cyber threats. And when is undesirable a badge of honor? It's Thursday, December 19th, 2024. I'm Dave Bittner, and this is your CyberWire Intel Briefing. Thanks again for joining us here. It is great to have you with us. CISA has urged senior government officials to enhance mobile device security following the Salt Typhoon breach, where Chinese hackers accessed the phone data, messages, and calls of 150 top U.S. officials. The agency recommends using end-to-end encrypted apps and warns that all communications, government or personal, are at risk of interception or manipulation. High-profile targets included President-elect Donald Trump, Vice President Kamala Harris's staff, and Senator Chuck Schumer. CISA's latest advisory emphasizes a whole-of-government effort to secure mobile ecosystems, with insights gathered from over 5 million devices across 94 agencies. The breach underscores the vulnerability of U.S. telecom networks, with Chinese hackers reportedly maintaining access to compromised systems. The breach has escalated U.S.-China cyber tensions, prompting discussions about banning TP-Link routers, widely used in federal operations. China, in turn, accuses U.S. intelligence of cyber attacks against its tech firms, alleging the theft of sensitive data and exploitation of software vulnerabilities. The cyber standoff continues to intensify. Russian state-sponsored hacker group Sandworm is targeting Ukrainian soldiers in a new espionage campaign, according to MilCert.ua. The hackers create fake websites mimicking the Ukrainian military app Army Plus to trick users into downloading malicious software. Army Plus, launched earlier this year, streamlines bureaucratic tasks for soldiers, making it a critical tool. The fake sites, hosted on Cloudflare Workers, deliver an installer crafted with NSYS. When executed, the file grants hackers hidden access to compromised systems, allowing data exfiltration via the Tor network. CERT UA links this campaign to Sandworm, known for major attacks like the 2015 power grid disruption and the 2017 NotPetya incident. This operation underscores ongoing Russian cyber aggression targeting Ukraine's military infrastructure. Recent attacks include malware planted in messaging apps and campaigns aimed at conscripts, highlighting a persistent focus on disrupting Ukrainian forces. A website bug in GPS tracking firm Happen is exposing customer names, affiliations, and data on over 8,600 GPS trackers, TechCrunch reports. While location data isn't included, IMEI numbers and details about business affiliations of users are accessible through developer tools. Happen, formerly SpyTech, provides GPS tracking for vehicles and possessions and claims over 460,000 tracked devices, including Fortune 500 customers. The company has not responded to multiple outreach attempts, leaving the data exposed. Multiple critical vulnerabilities have been identified in Sharp routers and models from NTT Docomo, SoftBank, and KDDI, requiring immediate firmware updates. The most severe flaw allows remote exploitation without authentication, enabling attackers to execute commands with root privileges. Other issues include OS command injection, improper authentication, and buffer overflow risks. Users should check advisories and update firmware promptly to mitigate risks. Ireland's Data Protection Commission fined Meta $263 million for alleged GDPR violations tied to a 2018 Facebook data breach affecting 29 million accounts globally. The breach, linked to a flaw in Meta's video upload system, exposed sensitive user data, including locations, religions, genders, children's personal data, phone numbers, and email addresses. The DPC cited Meta's failure to integrate adequate data protection measures into its systems, poor breach documentation, and inadequate compliance practices. This fine follows several others against Meta, including €1.2 billion in May 2023 for improper EU-US data transfers and €405 million in 2021 for mishandling minors' data. Meta responded by highlighting its corrective actions and commitment to user safety. Google has released an urgent Chrome security update to address 4 high-rated vulnerabilities affecting over 3 billion users. The issues include type confusion, out-of-bounds memory access, and use-after-free flaws in the Chrome version 8 JavaScript engine and browser compositing function. Security researchers earned $75,000 in bounties for identifying these risks. Users are urged to update Chrome and restart the browser to activate protection. Dark Reading reports that cyber attacks on India-based organizations surged 92% year-over-year in the third quarter of 2024, with nearly 1.2 billion attacks recorded, up from 600 million the previous year, according to IndusFace. The attacks, including 377 million denial-of-service events and 215 million bot-driven API requests, are increasingly exploiting vulnerabilities in APIs and websites, fueled by AI tools like large language models. These tools lower the barrier for hackers, enabling rapid exploitation of issues like SQL injection. The banking, financial services, and utilities sectors were heavily targeted, with geopolitical motives driving disruptions. Despite rising threats, only 19% of Indian companies use automated API security scanners, while over 30% of critical vulnerabilities remain unpatched after 6 months. With 44% of Indian businesses reporting data breaches costing over $500,000 in 3 years, cybersecurity is now a top priority for 61% of executives, according to PwC. Cybercriminals are targeting Google Calendar, used by over 500 million people, to launch phishing attacks, according to Checkpoint Research. Attackers exploit Google Calendar's features like Google Drawings and Google Forms to send emails with malicious links that bypass traditional security filters. These links often redirect victims to fake login pages or fraudulent websites, stealing sensitive data like passwords or financial details. Over 4,000 phishing emails affecting 300 brands were detected in a recent 4-week period. Fortinet has released patches for a critical vulnerability in FortiWLM, a wireless management tool, which could allow unauthenticated remote attackers to execute arbitrary code or access sensitive files via a path traversal flaw. The issue affects multiple versions of FortiWLM, with updated versions resolving the issue. Security researcher Zach Hanley of Horizon3.ai reported the flaw, noting it could allow attackers to hijack admin sessions. Fortinet also patched a related OS command injection bug in FortiManager. Juniper Networks warns of a botnet infection campaign targeting routers with default credentials, exploiting Mirai malware. Customers reported unusual activity on Session smart routers, which were compromised and used in DDoS attacks. The malware scans for devices using default passwords, gains access, and executes malicious commands. Juniper advises changing default credentials, using strong passwords, monitoring for unusual behavior, blocking unauthorized access with firewalls, and keeping devices updated. Re-imaging infected devices is the only surefire way to eliminate the threat. Coming up after the break, Jeff Kroll from Baker Tilly's cybersecurity practice has advice on using employee access controls to limit internal cyber threats. And when is undesirable a badge of honor? Stay with us. And now, a word from our sponsor, KnowBe4. It's all connected, and we're not talking conspiracy theories. When it comes to InfoSec tools, effective integrations can make or break your security stack. The same should be true for security awareness training. KnowBe4, provider of the world's largest library of security awareness training, provides a way to integrate your existing security stack tools to help you strengthen your organization's security culture. KnowBe4's Security Coach uses standard APIs to quickly and easily integrate with your existing security products from vendors like Microsoft, CrowdStrike, and Cisco, 35 vendor integrations and counting. Security Coach analyzes your security stack alerts to identify events related to any risky security behavior from your users. Use this information to set up real-time coaching campaigns targeting risky users based on those events from your network, endpoint, identity, or web security vendors. Then coach your users at the moment the risky behavior occurs, with contextual security tips delivered via Microsoft Teams, Slack, or email. Learn more at knowbefore.com/securitycoach. That's knowbefore.com/securitycoach. And we thank KnowBe4 for sponsoring our show. The IT world used to be simpler. You only had to secure and manage environments that you controlled. Then came new technologies and new ways to work. Now, employees, apps, and networks are everywhere. This means poor visibility, security gaps, and added risk. That's why Cloudflare created the first-ever connectivity cloud. Visit cloudflare.com to protect your business everywhere you do business. Jeff Kroll is principal and practice leader of Baker Tilly's cybersecurity practice. I recently caught up with him for advice on using employee access controls to limit internal cyber threats.
It's interesting. It's really a wide spectrum, but it's really an area that I think a lot of organizations don't necessarily put as much scrutiny to as they should. So really, when you think about employees, right, they're the ones who have access to almost everything in an organization, right? They're running the organization. They need access to whatever applications you have, whatever systems you have, whatever SharePoints you have. So it's usually, depending on the size of organization, a lot of people and a lot of organizations, I would say, put in processes to add a new user, delete a user, modify access for a user. The scrutiny that's not always there, though, is within all of those processes for changing a user's access, is how much access should they have. So it's an interesting area where, in my mind, employee access really goes from the day an employee shows up, or even when you're interviewing them in some cases, all the way through to when, ultimately they leave the organization. All of the bells and whistles and controls along the way of how somebody gets access, gets granted access, gets moved access, and ultimately loses access is all in that population, as well as obviously authentication mechanisms and how people are authenticated for what they have.
Well, let's dig into some of the details here. What would you consider to be best practices?
Real best practice is interesting because, a lot of people these days are talking about zero trust environments, and people, for years before that have talked about least privilege as a concept, right? And so really the real best practice in my mind is, and it's easier said than done, making sure employees only have access to the things they need to have access to contemporaneous with when they need to have that access, right? So I'll use healthcare as usually a relatively straightforward example of that, right? Let's say you have a hospital and you have a whole bunch of nurses. Should all of the nurses have access to all the floors at any given time? Well, probably not, right? Ultimately, you figure those nurses should only have access to the floor they're working on that day, right? Or that shift. And maybe even you narrow it down further to say, well, you have a scheduling system. Could you somehow real time only grant access to the floor, to the nurse, to the patients that nurse is working with on that floor at that given time? Sounds great in theory, right? It sounds like, well, yeah, of course. Why should the nurse have access to everything? Because if somebody breaks into her account, they have access to everything. If the nurse wants to do something bad, she has access to everything. So if you can limit her access to just those patients, just that floor, just that time, all of a sudden you've really mitigated the risk of access related to that employee, right? The challenge with that is obviously when you think through that, without some real heavy duty thought and automation around those things, it's really, really difficult to do. So that's why I really think, even though that I would say is the best practice, is to really limit people to only what they need access to really get their job done. You have these competing priorities, both with regards to operationalizing that and how do you make that actually work in a real life environment, and can your technology support you to be able to do that? You also have challenges sometimes just with management of an organization saying, well, that's great that you only want this nurse to work on this floor at this time, but he or she maybe gets called up to another floor. And how am I going to handle that? And it's an emergency situation. And so what happens is sometimes operationally, people go to the other end of the spectrum and say, give them access to everything because we don't know what'll go on. So there's kind of this interesting balance there that gets really difficult to manage.
It's really easy for me to imagine the system starting to erode, as people get annoyed with it, right? Somebody needs access to something, they can't get it, they complain loudly, and the people who are in charge kind of throw up their hands and say, okay, give this person access to this, and then it never goes away. Am I speaking about a realistic peril here?
You are spot on. That is exactly what happens. And, even though people talk about reviewing access, I always say, do periodic access reviews really get to that deep level, right? Probably not, right? So a lot of times what we find is once access is granted, it usually persists. And, a lot of times the people making the decisions, I'll call it from an IT department or cybersecurity department, right? The people who are, a lot of times looking to say, hey, let's limit access, let's keep it tight. They may not be as involved in the business process to always be ready to push back on some of those decisions, right? When somebody in the business is saying, no, our people all need this access. And hey, look, yesterday we had this big problem, and that big problem is because they didn't have access. So go grant some more access. It's sometimes difficult for them, not being necessarily the experts in whatever that business process is, to be able to be like, well, wait a second, I get that happened yesterday, but that's like a once in a year event. And we could probably design some type of, exception process we could work when that once in a year event happens. But because they're not necessarily in the know, to your point, somebody's screaming, somebody's mad, and all of a sudden access gets expanded beyond what is probably the ideal access.
I mean, it really strikes me that communication is a real key part of implementing this sort of thing effectively.
Yeah, it's absolutely communication, and I think there's an element of buy-in. A lot of times from the what I'll call it the non-IT professionals, the business professionals, don't always have the mindset that they need to keep access really limited. And so I think that's one of the hurdles a lot of organizations need to overcome is not that they're doing something wrong by asking for the additional access, but rather helping them to understand what the potential risks are of that additional access, right? Because we all know it's a matter of when, not if, every organization or almost every organization has some type of cyber event, some type of breach, right? Well, those breaches get a lot easier if the access that they get into is somebody who has their access really limited. Those breaches get a lot harder when that access is really broad.
Well, in your experience, do you have any words of wisdom here for how to strike that balance between limiting access but also limiting friction?
It's a difficult thing. I think it's really a tone at the top issue, meaning I think, a cyber IT department can work with whatever procurement department, right? They try and come to a meeting of the minds. And that can obviously happen. But what I find the best controlled organizations from a cyber perspective tend to be the ones where the boardroom cares and your C-suite cares, and they set the message that they really want to be a secure organization, and that then starts permeating down. That's really where it needs to come from, and really viewing it not as an IT thing but as a business risk, right? Cyber and access is not an IT risk, it's a business risk. And the organizations that view it as a business risk and drive it down through the organization that way, at least in my experience, tend to have a better security posture, maybe not perfect, but a better security posture than the ones who view it, the age old saying, that's an IT problem. Those are the ones that tend not to be as well secured.
What about the folks who tend to have the most access? I would hate to be the IT person who has to report to the CEO and say, "You're not going to be able to access everything whenever you want to." How's that going to fly, right?
So that's a great question, right? And we run into that a lot where some of the higher up executives start asking for more and more access. Generally speaking, not exclusively, but generally speaking, we actually view it as more of a risk when the higher ups have excessive access, right? Because if you think about a CEO of a company, of a large organization, everybody knows the name of that CEO. And there's lots of people doing all sorts of investigation into what that person does, whether they like it or not, right? There's lots of bad actors out there trying to glean information and figure out, nuances that CEO, ways they could potentially spoof them when they go on vacation, stuff like that. So usually the higher up you are in an organization, the less access you actually want that person to have. You actually want to take that access out of their hands and give it to somebody maybe a little lower down. Obviously, recognizing sometimes there's sensitive data, things like that you couldn't do that with. But what I call the rank and file, super user type access, we usually recommend, unless there's a really good reason, don't get that in the hands of your C-suite. In fact, take information access out of their hands because they're by nature a target of bad actors.
Every organization setting down this path has their own particular starting point here. Do you have any advice for those folks as they're heading down this path to make it as easy for everybody involved as possible?
Yeah, the biggest advice I always have is don't try to boil the ocean, right? There's going to be lots of applications. You're never done with reviewing access. You're never done with, trying to get access to where you want it to be. A lot of organizations I do see sometimes get caught up in, analysis paralysis. And we have 100 applications and we need to find data owners and we need to do this, we need to do that. And while you want to have good processes across the board that are sustainable, usually it's actually better to just say, okay, if we have 100 applications, let's pick one or two. Let's knock them out. Let's figure out what works for us as an organization. Get your quick wins, right? Get your quick, hey, here's where we were able to limit access, and then start working through the other 100, right? You don't have to get everything done tomorrow. Obviously, the sooner you get it done, the better. But a lot of organizations almost bite off more than they can chew a lot of times in these access control projects. And as a result, because they bite off so much, they actually don't get anything done over a period of time. versus trying to, break it into bite-sized pieces and say, we're going to go deal with this department for the next 3 months.
That's Jeff Kroll, Principal and Practice Leader of Baker Tilly's Cybersecurity Practice. And finally, Russia has labeled cybersecurity firm Recorded Future as undesirable, a badge CEO Christopher Ahlberg cheekily dubbed a rare compliment. The Russian prosecutor general accused the firm of aiding Ukraine in offensive information operations and supporting the West's propaganda campaign. Ahlberg and team, undeterred, probably framed the notice. Recorded Future has actively supported Ukraine since Russia's full-scale invasion, providing $10 million in intelligence cloud access, $20 million in aid in 2023 alone, and collaborating with 16 Ukrainian agencies to protect critical infrastructure and investigate war crimes. Their insect group's research, often spotlighting Russian cyber antics, likely didn't win them any fans in Moscow. Interestingly, they're the first cybersecurity company to make Russia's undesirable list, typically reserved for NGOs and media. Imagine being so effective that an entire country bans you. And that's the CyberWire. For links to all of today's stories, check out our daily briefing at thecyberwire.com. We'd love to know what you think of this podcast. Your feedback ensures we deliver the insights that keep you a step ahead in the rapidly changing world of cybersecurity. If you like our show, please share a rating and review in your favorite podcast app. Please also fill out the survey in the show notes or send an email to cyberwire@n2k.com. We're privileged that N2K CyberWire is part of the daily routine of the most influential leaders and operators in the public and private sector, from the Fortune 500 to many of the world's preeminent intelligence and law enforcement agencies. This episode was produced by Liz Stokes. Our mixer is Trey Hester, with original music and sound design by Elliot Peltzman. Our executive producer is Jennifer Iben. Our executive editor is Brandon Karp. Simone Petrella is our president. Peter Kilpie is our publisher. And I'm Dave Bittner. Thanks for listening. We'll see you back here tomorrow.